Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming today, everyone. My name is Brittany. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Wayland Library, and we are so happy to have Mei-Ling Ellerman hosting this beginner drawing workshop. Today, I have Mei-Ling's website and Instagram information in the chat for you to reference, and just a little bit about Mei-Ling before we get started. She is an artist, printmaker, and teacher whose art is inspired by the complex beauty of nature, wildlife, and ancient Asian designs. She loves celebrating women, whimsical art for children in her artwork, and her experiences as a mother activist and forager of herbs, mushrooms, and being an herbalist shapes her artwork. So I will turn it over to Mei-Ling. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for the introduction, and special thanks to the Wayland Free Public Library for hosting this workshop, and also to Courtney Michael for all her work in helping to organize the workshop. So I'm Mei-Ling Ellerman. I'm a local artist and printmaker. Okay, local artist and printmaker. I've been, I wonder if I could change the view. Or I suppose, okay, I'll keep it like that. Yeah, so I've been trained in both drawing and sculpture, and I've taught myself printmaking. So I've been doing printmaking for a number of years. And I also dabble in watercolor and in photography, which you can see if you check out my Instagram account under Mei-Ling Ellerman Studio. But no matter what type of art you practice, what type of drawing, whether you're drawing wildlife, classical portraits, pets, or even designs for printmaking, like designs for these drawings, there are certain skills that you want to develop. So first, you need to learn how to observe your subject accurately. And then you want to be able to transfer, you want the skills to be able to transfer your observations to paper. So this is what I've been teaching for a number of years, how to hone my students' eyes for perceiving something accurately, and then the techniques and the skills and the tricks to transferring it to paper. And we use different mediums as well. So I really believe, and I know from having taught so many students, that anybody can learn how to draw, that it's not an innate ability. I've had older students who waited until they retired. They wanted to draw for many years, but they didn't take any drawing classes till they retired, and then they felt unsure whether they could learn how to draw well. So I've watched them over just several classes learn how to make subtle observations, learn new techniques, and to draw really quite impressive drawings. And I'll share some of those at the very end. And they also start to develop their own styles over time with practice. I'm hoping that today's workshop will give you a sense of this process of learning how to draw, of learning how to see differently, and overcoming what we could call preconceptions about certain subjects that we draw. So for example, when we're young, we tend to draw things in a more stylized way. Like for example, drawing flowers. So we might draw flowers with symmetrical petals in a loop, and our flowers might look pretty similar. Our drawings of people or our portraits might also look fairly similar. Maybe that the hair is different, but the features tend to be fairly similar, and the structure of the body. So I teach students how to move away from this type of stylized or symbolic drawing and to really observe what's in front of them. For example, when people start to draw portraits, they often draw eyes as sort of football shapes or almond shapes, and whole circles for the irises and the pupils. But if you're drawing eyes, for example, if you drew a line from one corner of the eye to the other, you would find that most of your eye would be above that line. So already there, we know that an eye is not symmetrical. It doesn't have symmetrical lines. And then also, unless you open your eyes incredibly wide, your upper eyelid is always going to cover your iris, part of your iris. So you're never going to see the whole circle of your iris. And this is actually going to be our main drawing exercise today. So I'm going to teach you how to draw an accurate eye. We'll do two exercises. So first of all, before I start my slideshow, I'm wondering if there's anyone who could just tell me when you're done with certain steps of the drawing process, because the eye drawing is going to be pretty detailed, and maybe just share your work. If we don't have that many students today, we can actually just have you, hold up your work, I think. So I don't know if is there anyone? I was going to have a friend who is going to hopefully come in who will also volunteer. Okay. So that's fine if you don't want to share. So I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint now. Ooh. Brittany, I'm wondering if you can switch back host because it disabled the participant screen sharing.
I am on it.
Okay, great. Okay, super. Okay. So in my classes, I teach about 4 different types of perceptions that are fundamental for drawing. So the first is a perception of edges. So this is, oh, met someone. Okay. So this is essential to just draw the outline or the contour of a drawing. This is a drawing by Henri Matisse, and it's a line drawing. So in order to draw it, he had to not only figure out the outline of the flowers and the leaves and the picture, but he had to also observe and look at the outline, the contours of each leaf and petal. So they're lines both on the exterior and the interior. So the second perception here is a perception of space, of spaces. So this also includes the spaces and the shapes within a subject, as well as the shapes outside. So some of you might have come across the concept of negative space too, which I'll talk about. So for example, this lovely photo of a girl. If we were drawing her, we would approach different parts in different ways. So for example, for her neck here, we might line it up with her jaw. We would draw her face first and then line it up with her jaw. And we would look at the angle of the different planes and the angle of these lines here. We would look at the shape that her chin creates, the curve of her chin. And then for the bottom, we could think about how the shirt creates an upside down triangular shape. And then also for, in terms of negative space exercises, we could use that to make our outlines more accurate. So here, if we look at her cheek and her ear, her neck and her collar, if you focus on the background instead of the parts of her body, then that space creates its own shape, and that's negative space. So I have my students do negative space exercises and different sort of exercises that help us to really focus on what our subject looks like, rather than what we expect it to look like. So the third thing that I talk about is the perception of relationships. And so that has to do with proportion, with perspective. For example, with this fox, we would figure out how tall the torso is compared to the legs, and they're about the same height. And then we might also use what we call a head length. So we might use the width of a head to figure out how long the fox is or how long the tail should be. So that's just an example. And then finally, and this is incredibly important, the perception of light and shadows, to be able to look at an object and to pick out the different, what we call different values. So you might know this as different shades or different tones. And that takes an outline, like the outline of this apple, and makes it look like a three-dimensional object. And so we'll do some of this work today as well. So I'm going to mention this, go back to this type of drawing that I talked about. This type of drawing that we learned when we were children, which is more of a symbolic style, is not necessarily very realistic. So these are two portraits drawn by children around 10 years old. They had some sort of art education, probably online classes. And there are aspects of these drawings that really show attention to detail, but there are also parts that need to be reworked. So let's look at the one on the left. So the student, this is a bit stylized, the drawing on the left. The student captured the lines of the jaw fairly well, and also the volume of the hair. That's really good. But you can see that the eyes are very large and exaggerated. And in fact, one eye is about the same size as his lips. Here. So with the student on the right, she captured the reflection in the eye. And so that's something that we'll be doing as well. And the irises and the pupil. And she has some shading on the cheeks. So these are good observations. But you can see that the eyes are fairly symmetrical shapes. You don't see the tear duct. And if you compare it to the size of the nose, well, you know, it's a good line for the nose, it's extremely small. And the mouth is set too low. So another thing about these drawings is that we tend to draw not only large facial features, but we tend to really focus mostly on facial features and to leave the rest of the face blank. And when you think about somebody's face, it's completely dimensional. So there's really no flat places. Everywhere it's a curve or, you know, something protrudes. Nothing is really a hard edge and nothing is really flat. So we really need to learn how to draw in different, how to shade in different values to get those contours of the face. And I should also say that as social beings and human beings, we naturally place a lot of emphasis on facial features. That's what we pay attention to. And so that transfers to our drawing. And that's why we tend to draw really large facial features and sometimes, well, not usually larger noses than normal. It's usually the eyes that are much larger than normal. So now let's take a look at this photo and the proportions of her face. So looking at the size of her eyes compared to her nose and her mouth, we see that they're much smaller, maybe even much smaller than what we would expect them to be. So not only do we tend to expect facial features to be really large, but we might have expectations for where they should be on the face. So can anyone guess where the eyes should be drawn on the head?
I think in the middle.
That's right. Did somebody tell you that? Thank you, Isabel. That's exactly right. So almost always people think that it's a third of the way down because we focus on the facial features and we forget about the top of the head. But if you measure, so you can measure with your fingers, yeah, from, you know, on yourself or on the model, from eye level to the top of your head, eye level to your chin, it's going to be right in the middle. So usually what happens is students draw the eyes too high, and this sort of cuts off the top of the head. It makes it look too small, too short. So another tip that I teach my students is that you can use, when you're looking at the eye level, you can use the eye width as a measure. So for example, one of her eyes is the exact same width as her other eye because it's a full frontal portrait photo. And that is also equal to the distance between her eyes. So for some people, it's not true for her, but for other people, the distance from the outside corner of your eye to the side of your head will also be one eye width. So some people have 5 eye widths across. So when I teach my portraiture course, we go through all these proportions to get things right. Okay. So now let's look at a different photo. When I teach portraiture, I like to use photos of different people of different ages, different genders, and races and ethnicities. And I also often change my photos. I desaturate them to black and white because it's easier to transfer to paper. So first, let's just look at his eyes within the context of the face. So even though our main drawing is going to be an eye drawing, I want to first talk about this, the structure of the face, and to help you start to look at the different tones or shades or values. So we can think of the face in terms of the dimension and the curves and the shapes. And I'm going to describe this area around the eye to you. Once we really start to observe what we're drawing, we get into a sort of zone. And this is a zone where we really focus and we can observe and draw more accurately. So above the eye, we have the brow bone, and the brow bone is there to protect the eye, if you fall or something hits you. And because it protrudes, then depending on where the lighting is coming from, particularly if above, then it's going to cast a shadow. So you're always going to have a shadow, almost always under the brow bone. And then because our eyeballs are completely round, and set back in the sockets, then it's going to push out our eyelids a bit. So you have a bit of curvature in the upper eyelid. And I should mention that eyelids are also going to vary depending on race, ethnicity, and age. So you might have a single fold in your eyelid, you might have no folds, or you might have this older gentleman here has an overlapping line on his eyelid. And then let's look between the eyes. This part, can you see my cursor? So this part right here is called the glabella, in between the eyebrows and in between the eyes. And it's actually slanted downwards like this, slanted in a bit. And so that and the edge of the nose creates the side, this part, the side of the eye. And there's often shadows there. So even if you just draw one eye, you're probably going to have shadows that come from where it intersects with the side of the nose and the glabella here. Let's see. Okay, so also because of the lower eyelid protrudes a little bit, you're also going to have a little bit of a shadow underneath the eye right here. So now that we've gone over this area around the eye, let's refocus on the face. Let's step back and take a look at the different values. So between the highlights, so if we think of the lightest areas on his face and the darkest areas, there are many intermediate values. Can anyone tell me what some of the highlights on his face are? You can unmute if anyone wants to share.
The underneath his eye. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yep.
Underneath his eye.
On his nose.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Anywhere else?
The whites of the eye?
Yes. Yes, definitely the whites of the eye. And also a bit, there's light that is hitting it. Mm-hmm.
Nose.
Yes. Yes. And his forehead. So I should also mention that whenever we look at a subject, we want to think about the light source, because that's going to give us a lot of information about how the light is hitting it and where the shadows need to be. And so we want to be consistent with that in our drawings. What about the darkest areas?
The side of the face that's the farthest from the light source is dark. His ear, the ear that's on the left, his right ear is very dark.
Mm-hmm.
The creases in his face are definitely darker.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's more of a sort of intermediate value.
Yeah.
It's darker, definitely.
And the hollows between his eyes and his nose are pretty pronounced.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah,
Up
exactly.
here.
Yep,
Yes.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right.
The folds and creases in his hat.
Yes. Hat is certainly going to be very dark. And his nostrils too. So nostrils will usually, so I'm not teaching about nostrils today, about noses today. I do teach a class in portraiture on, I do, nose and mouth, and I do ears and eyes. Those are two different classes. But I'll just point out that the reason why we see nostrils is because the nose is slanted down like this. So it's not flat, slanted down. So that's why we can see the nostrils. And this part of the nose, there's cartilage that wraps down and around. So this is going to be lower and the nostrils will be higher. So that will help you when you're thinking about drawing somebody's nose. And let's think about some of the values in between. I think it may have been Stephanie who mentioned the shadows to the side here, because we know that the light source is coming from, let's say, if we're the photographer, from our right, rear right, there's a darker value on the left side of his nose as we look at it than on the right side of his nose. And so we would really focus and we would start breaking down the picture into these different shades. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is a 9 value scale. This is something that artists might think about and use in their drawing. They might use this, this many or even more different values from light to dark. And so when you're drawing something, usually you're not going to have just dark and light. You're going to have this range. So you want to think about how the light is hitting an object and curving around it. And so you're probably going to have a gradation when you're shading it in. So now we're going to look at this lighting, this egg, and talk about the light and the shadows on this egg. So where do you think the lighting is coming from?
Upper right.
Mm-hmm. So we can see that the values, if we really generalize, the values are divided into, there's a light side and a dark side. So what are the darkest areas that you can see on the egg? Where do you think the darkest area is?
Upper left.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this strip here is called the core shadow. So that's going to be the darkest part, the darkest shadow on an object. So we also have the highlight here. We have the more diffuse light here. If we look at the shadow side of the egg, we see that it's not evenly dark. So this is because it's on a white surface and there's reflected light that's bouncing off and it's hitting the bottom. So it's actually lighting up the bottom of the egg, creating this sort of almost triangular shaped shadow. The darkest part is right underneath. So this is called the occlusion shade. And that's because the egg is sitting on a surface, so no light can get down there. So that's the very darkest part. So I'd like you to take your paper, and we're going to use one side to do a drawing exercise. And before we start drawing this egg, which we will also do, I'd like you to just practice even shading. So I'll show you. Sometimes when you shade, you might not want to use the tip of a pencil, but to change your grip. So usually we draw like this, but if you scoot your fingers up, then you'll have a lower angle to the paper and you can use the side of the pencil. So that's a technique that we often use for shading. And I'd like for you to shade starting out with the lightest shade on the left, if you're right-handed, and then start to gradually and evenly get darker. So I'll show you an example. So if you can start light and then go up and down and gradually get darker, 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 and then switch and start dark and then evenly shade in and then get lighter and lighter. So this will give you a sense of the gradations, the different values that we're going to put into the egg. Isabel, can you let me know if you're done?
I'm still working on it.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
challenging
Yeah, I just wanted to get a sense.
because it's hard to control the pencil to get that even gradient.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have a question. My name is Rose Horowitz.
Yes.
This is the first time I'm new here also. This class is, what do? You show the picture, we take a picture and we draw at home?
Yes, you draw at home. So all you need is a few sheets of paper,
Yeah,
a pencil and an eraser. And so I'll lead you through all the exercises.
and then we turn it into you.
You can hold it up at the end. If you want feedback, I can also give feedback
Oh,
later on. Mhm.
I have to be very fast. Yeah, I'm very new. I'm just curious. Very interesting.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have. Thank you, Isabel. It's a little bit blurry. So we will probably take 15 minutes, 20 minutes to draw the egg.
What about the previous
And
picture about that portrait about a man with a
thank you,
beard
Stephanie.
and a hat? That would take a long time to draw.
I don't think it was taken that long ago. I got the portrait off of one of these websites. So when I'm drawing designs for my printmaking or picking photos for my portraiture class or the other classes that I teach, I usually use either Unsplash or Pixabay because you can use these photos without reference. And so this was a contemporary photo that was taken from one of those sites.
Can you put that in the chat or something? Could you put those websites in the chat for me? Thank you.
Right. So then if you want to flip your paper over, we're going to work on this egg and reproducing the lighting and the shadows on the egg using the sort of gradations that you just drew in these sketching exercise. So if you can draw just a egg shape, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect because this is mostly about the shading, but try to draw the outline of the egg. So it looks, it's just, I think that probably the narrower end is this end, the far end. But from this angle, it's fairly more or less symmetrical. Okay, and then once you have the egg shape, to start with the darker core shadow. So that's the shadow that you noted here, which has a sort of triangular shape and it's wider at the far end. So you can use the same technique to draw this darker part here. And then we'll work on the gradations after that. Isabella, can you let me know if you had a chance to do the core shadow?
Sorry, I was a little bit distracted.
Okay. That's okay.
Trying to multitask here.
Okay. No problem. So after shading in this dark core shadow area, then let's work on the upper side. So remember that the pressure, the amount of pressure that you use with the pencil is going to vary for the darkness. So you want to get a lighter strip here going along the upper side, curves around a little bit. And I suggest that you then lightly, like really lightly, try to shade in the rest of this whole section here. And you can even use a tissue or something to smudge it. And then to get the highlight, because we're working on white paper, you can use your eraser to lift it out. So the main point will be to try to not have any really dark and harsh lines, but to have more of a gradual shift in values. And then you will pick this out. You can pick out the highlight with your eraser. If somebody could just let me know when you're finished with that part. Rose, how is yours going?
Can I just ask again which shadow we're focusing on right now?
Just the upper half.
Okay, thank you.
Isabel, how is yours going? A little bit fuzzy, but I can see that you've already done the work. Oh, excellent. Great. Okay, so you've already worked on the bottom part. All right, so let's look at the bottom now. So the darker half of the egg here, as we noticed, it's not evenly dark. You have the reflected light. So this sort of value here, this subtle shading that wraps around the upper part of the core shadow, you can also have it reproduce it around the bottom half here. And so it wraps around to this point here, and then you have the reflected light. So this part here will be even lighter. And if you find that a part of your drawing looks too dark, you can try to lift out some of the graphite with an eraser. And I suggest that if you want to practice drawing often for this sort of thing, it's best to get a kneaded eraser. So like this sort of eraser, it comes in a square, and you just knead it, and you can use it to dab at the pigment. So whether it's colored pencil or just regular pencil, graphite pencil, and then you knead it, and it sort of disappears back in, and then you can use it again. So you don't have to use friction. It's a more subtle sort of eraser. Stephanie, could I ask if what point you're at?
I'll show you what I've got. It's coming
Okay.
along very slowly. Can you see?
Oh, very nice. Looks great.
It's funny how I noticed that I expected, like you were talking about bias going in, I expected the line of the shadow to really follow the contour of the egg, and it really doesn't. It's not nearly as rounded as the edge of the egg. It seems to be more of like a much straighter line from one point to the other. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I think probably because of the angle of the lighting
right,
in part.
right. So I would have expected it to, like, you know, faithfully follow the shape of the egg, but it doesn't at all.
Sophie, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
So I'm just going to talk about the shadow under the egg so that we have enough time for the final exercise too. So let's see. The occlusion shade, the darkest part will be right under the egg here. And then if we really focus on the shadow, we see that it's not just an evenly, again, it's not an evenly shaded shadow. Starts out darkest, then there's a sort of dark oval that really soft with really soft edges. And then it gets lighter again, which is sort of surprising, likely because there's light being reflected off the egg bouncing back onto the table. And then there's a darker edge here. And then there's an additional soft, very soft, diffuse edge around here and around the side. So I'll give you maybe just a few minutes to work on that, and then we'll move on because I have a few more slides I want to show you.
Can I ask you what's the surface of the table? Is it glass?
I don't think so. I think it's probably some sort of laminate
Oh, okay.
something. It's not, I didn't take the photo, so I'm not sure.
Because the shadow is kind of unusual. It's not a wood, it's a laminate.
Yeah, something like that.
Thank you.
Sure. And sometimes if we see funny shadows, it's because we have multiple light sources.
Oh.
So it's possible that there's another light source causing this, you know, extra bit of shadow here. I don't know.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
How would you approach the circular shadow? Would you try to outline it first, or would you start with the shading and then lift whatever you wanted to remove off of that to create the circle shape?
I probably would start with an outline, but a very light outline.
Right, a faint one, yeah.
Because you can always, you know, if you have a kneaded eraser and eraser, you can always lift the outline,
Yeah.
and that part will probably be dark enough that it's going to cover it anyways.
Right. Okay.
The shadow on the table looks like there are 3 levels. On the darker, and then a little bit of reflection, and then the outer edge, and then up beyond the egg, there's just some soft
Exactly.
reflection. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I have a basic question because I don't have any material today. How do you make a shadow to begin with, dark, with a pencil? and make lines or what?
Yeah,
Or
so like Stephanie mentioned, I would make an outline so that you get the shape, the overall shape of the shadow accurately.
Yeah.
And then I would start working on probably the darkest part underneath the egg and start shading back and forth, but in the, respecting the shape, the sort of oval,
Yeah.
oval
Right.
shape of the first shadow.
How do you begin with the darkest part, or how I mean, the
Sometimes
crisscross lines and then smear with your finger, or what?
I would not necessarily use cross hatching. So the technique that you refer to is cross hatching.
Yeah.
And so that's a great technique to use generally, but we want shadows to look smooth. So I suggest using the technique that you just used to create, that you just used to create this.
Yeah, but how do you create that?
So you move your finger up so that the pencil is at a low angle. And so you're using the side of the lid.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And there are also other blending techniques. So usually when I teach, I have my students get a variety of pencils. So what we normally use is this is my normal pencil. This is a HB. It's called 2HB or 2 pencil.
Number 2?
Yeah, number 2 pencil. So it's HB. So there's a range of pencils which are H, and there's a range of pencils which are Bs. So you've got like 2B, 4B, 6B, 8B. The higher up you get in the Bs, the softer the lead, or the softer the graphite, and the darker the color. So if you're trying to increase the contrast in a drawing, then you would use some of the darker Bs. The H's are the opposite. So as you go from 2H, 4H, 6H, 8H, you're getting harder. So it's a harder tip, which makes it lighter.
Oh.
So for example, if you're drawing something on white paper, you could use a 2H or a 4H to get those really, to get the light outline. Because you don't want a really heavy line.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next slide in the PowerPoint because there's some more things I want to share with you before we do our final exercise. If that's okay. There. Okay. So I just wanted to show you one full self-portrait so that you could see some of the mediums that are used, some of the pencil marks as well, and how the eyes are treated when you have to draw them fairly small. This is a self-portrait by Annibale Carracci from the 1500s. And this is one of my favorite types of paper to use, toned paper. So I'll just hold up my, one of the drawings I did of an older woman on toned paper, if you can see. So the benefits of toned paper is that the paper itself is a sort of medium tone, medium value. So it lets you add highlights, and that adds more dimension. So you see he used some sort of black chalk or charcoal or conte, and he also used white. So there's white on his forehead, corner of his eye, tip of his nose, his ear, and his collar. And that just adds a little pop, you know, extra dimension to the picture. So I really love tone paper and I use it a lot. You can see that so often it's popular for portraits to be not full frontal, but to be 3/4 and to have dramatic lighting. So this, you can see that well, I'll just say when we look at it, the right side of his face is cast in shadow. But then if you look at it carefully, again, it's not an even sort of shadow. You can see that there's a lot of lighter areas. So where we know that the face protrudes and casts a shadow, like the brow bone under the eye, that's darker. Here, darker. Around his nose is darker. His lips and under his chin. So there's reflected light on his face as well, even though the eye is also overall darker. And then if we look at his eye over here on the side of the light, where the light source is, we can see that the upper part of his eye is a little bit darker. And that's because of the eyelid often is going to cast a shadow, or the brow bone. And he left the lower part of the iris here a little bit lighter. And I think that was also deliberate because it makes the eye look a little bit more luminous, like you have light hitting that part of the iris and lighting it up. So I just wanted to show that to you.
So where the lighting come from?
So the lighting,
Come from the left side?
yes,
It,
lighting
it,
would come from the left,
it just doesn't look very real.
probably from, not from behind the viewer, but from sort of to his left and a bit to the rear.
Yeah.
Because you can see the shadow on the brow bone.
How come the face has
On the
shadow
front.
and then the body doesn't have any shadow?
Oh, so this I think is a technique, and I think that this is an effective technique
Oh, okay.
where you want the focus to really be on the face, and so you use rougher, less careful strokes for the hair and for the clothing.
Oh.
So some artists do put the shadows in on the clothing, but they just use rougher strokes. But here, this is a quick self-portrait, it was in the 1500s. So
Okay.
yeah, it's still pretty effective.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to look at an eye. And this is actually what we're going to use for the main exercise, but we're going to use a black and white as a reference photo. So I want to share some pointers before we start on this. So you saw with the last drawing, the last self-portrait, that the eyes were pretty small. And so he couldn't put in a lot of detail. Probably also because he didn't have, maybe that refined drawing instruments in the 1500s. I don't know. But here, because we're going to be looking at a very detailed eye, we need to think about each part of what we see. And so I'm going to start by pointing at the eyelids. So we don't want just a line to indicate each of the eyelids, because the eyelids actually have a thickness to them. So if you look at the lower eyelid here, you can see that there's this width, this thickness, and that the eyelashes actually come out of the outer side. So they're not, the eyelashes do not start from the line touching the eye, right? And the same with the upper eyelid. You can't really see it that much, but it's also thick. And you want to start, when we draw in the eyelashes, I'll have you start them higher up here, rather than down here where it actually touches the eye. So that's also going to make your drawing look more realistic. Now to look at the eye, the white of the eye, this is a sclera. So even though it's called the white of the eye, we don't want to leave it just white, because then that will flatten it out. We know that the eyeball is really round, And so we want to shade it as though it's a rounded object. And so we'll have sort of rounded shading here. And then thinking about the curve of the upper and lower lids, we can think about it in terms of, well, I find it helpful to think about it in terms of planes, like sort of straight lines, 1, 2, 3. So breaking the upper eyelid, let's say, into 3 planes. So like basically like a line here, here, and then here. So you'll turn that into a curve, but it helps you to think about it. And the lower eye into maybe 2 planes, like here, it's more or less straight line. And then you see here, this is a little bit of a diagonal line because you're wrapping around. The eyelid wraps around there. Okay. Also point out the tear duct. So tear ducts also really add to the realism of an eye drawing, and they are pointed downwards. They're slightly sloping downwards here. And then I always have my students add in highlights to eyes. So that's essential for getting a great eye drawing. So we can see that there's 2 reflections in this woman's eye here. And the reflections are never going to be symmetrical. So they're never going to be rectangular or a square. They're always going to be a little bit curved in some way because of the curved surface of the eye. So that's also going to add to the impression that the eye is curved, even though you're drawing it, you know, on a flat piece of paper. Okay. And now we look at the fold above the eye, above the eyelid here. So there's a darkest value right in between, but then the fold also casts a shadow on the eyelid. So you've got some softer, lighter values here. You've got a highlight here. And then you want to be able to capture this curve right here. And you'll do that by, you know, you start with the dark shading here, and then you gradually, like with the egg, you lighten your shading. And it will be easier once I show you the black and white, I think. So the last part is the eyebrow. So first of all, to always pay attention if you're drawing animals or people, to think about the pattern of the hair growth and the way that the fur or the hair is moving. So for eyebrows, usually at the inner end, the hair will start sort of moving up at a diagonal, and then there'll be some short hairs that are coming down also at a diagonal, going this way. And then the further you move out, the hairs will start to grow more horizontally, like right here. And so how to locate the eyebrow, you can use the negative space exercise. So you can think about sort of if this big shape here, this big, I'm not sure what you would, trumpet shape, what you would call it here, but it'll give you a sense of, I teach my students how to look back and forth between 2 reference points to sort of start to get a sense of how to gauge the distance between 2 things. So you'll already have drawn the fold here. And so you go up and down, and you sort of get a sense of what the distance is between different parts, between here and between this arch and the eyebrow, for example. So I can give you feedback later on your drawings. So now that we've gone over these points, I think that we're ready to start in on the eye exercise. And I have here, black and white desaturated photo, a little bit larger. I think it's a bit easier to draw. If you can get out a new sheet of paper for this, I'd like you to draw an eye that's bigger than life, So maybe 3 or 4 inches wide. And I think we have about half an hour. So I can also, if we don't finish in time, I can send you the reference photo if you want to finish later on. Hopefully we can finish. So I would start by first, estimating 3 to 4 inches, marking that off. And then we can start working on the curve of the upper and lower lids here. So I suggest starting from the tear duct and moving up and thinking about these different planes, how each part of the eye, thinking about the angle. And one trick that I have my students use is if you're unsure about the angle of a certain part of your subject, to just hold a pencil up to it and then put it down on your paper so you can capture that same angle. Or you can just sort of hover your finger or your pencil over your screen and draw it. So this will give you a sort of tactile memory or feeling for getting that line. So when I initially go in and I draw an outline, I'm almost always going to be going over it a couple more times to make sure that it's right. So it doesn't have to be, perfect the first time that you do it. So we'd start at the tear duct, go up, over and down. And then once you have that line, then you can go from the right corner of the eye. Remember the eye starting to wrap around there. So it's a diagonal line here, and then curving around, sort of straightening out, and then you're going to complete the tear duct. Sorry, Stephanie, just drawing paper if you have it, or printer paper if you don't, whatever type of paper. Drawing paper is best, but printer paper is fine. If somebody could let me know when you're done, and then we'll move on to the next step. Or also, if you want some feedback, I can take a look. I can try and expand my screen. You can also draw a little line for the edge of the tear duct here while you're doing this outline here. Stephanie, how is yours going?
So far, I just have the shape of the eyebrow and the shape of the upper lid done.
Okay, so I'll move on if you're already there.
Yeah, okay.
Great. Okay, so now let's go ahead and draw in the iris and the pupil. So when we look at the outline of the iris, we see that the top part is covered by the eyelid, as we expect, and that the pupil and the iris are off center. So it's helpful to do negative space exercise here. So to look at the curve, let's say, of the left side of the iris, and to think about how the shape of the sclera of the white of the eye on the left. And then do the same for the right side. And so you don't have to, don't bother with any details yet, just the outline. The outline of the iris, the outline of the pupil, and also I'd like you to put in the highlights at this point. So to look at the shape, how it's sort of, this one is slightly curved, this one on the left here. Just block it out lightly. And then this one is slants inwards towards the top because of the curved surface of the eye. This one here. So you won't draw a complete circle for the pupil because the highlight is covering that part of the pupil. So at this point, when you're doing the negative space exercise, you might find that you need to correct part of the shape, the outer shape of the eyelids too. And look at how big the iris is compared to the overall eye. So if we want to be very exact, we could use certain measuring tricks. Like for example, the width of the iris here is about the same as the distance between the edge of the iris and the tear duct. And the width from the one side of the pupil to the other side of the iris is also about the same as from here at the side of the iris to the right side of the eye. So, and then after you've drawn those in, if you could also draw a light line just indicating the outside of the eyelids, because the eyelids are thick and we want to have a suggestion of the outer side because that's where we're going to be having the eyelashes come out of. And Stephanie, you asked a question about the paper. I use more toned paper, but for this, I've started to use the mixed media paper, which is toned. It's smoother. And I also get a larger size.
What's the word? I'm sorry. The word is tuned or toned?
Toned.
Toned. Okay, that's what
yeah. So you can get a gray toned or you can get beige, but I've only worked with gray.
Okay.
I mean, beige I think would be good for portraits too. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So now let's draw in the fold of the upper eyelid. So it starts slightly above the very left-hand edge of the tear duct. And you can look at how much distance there is from the outside of the eyelid, the upper side of the eyelid, to sort of look at this shape that it creates if the eyelashes weren't there. So you can just draw it in as a line. And then I'm also going to ask you to draw in a very light outline of the eyebrow. Also thinking about the shape in between once you have the eyelid fold down. Shape between the eyelid fold and the eyebrow. And then if there's anybody who wants to send me their photo, then I'd be happy to give feedback. You would have to take a photo. So what I usually do in my courses is that I keep my classes small, around 6 people, so that I can see everybody, and when we're at initial stages, they can hold up their drawings. But then once we get further along and they need more detailed feedback, I ask them to take a photo of it and to email it to me. And then I download it and I put it up, and then I give comments and feedback on everybody's work. And so everybody can see, the areas that were done really well, the areas that need tweaking. And this is how they they start to develop their eye for improving their own work. I'll just see if is there anybody who wants to send me a photo or to hold theirs up. If not, we can move on to shading. Thank you, Sophie. Great. Okay. Let's see. Build a little closer. Great. I feel like it should maybe be a little bit shorter on this side and come down here. Stephanie, if you want to look at the length, the distance between the iris and the right side of the eye. Otherwise, I think the left side is great. Almost there. Okay. So let's start on shading now. Let's go back to the white of the eye here. And I'm going to suggest that you go along the top of the sclera here. And whoa, what was that? And then add a light shadow up here. And you can skip the highlight because we're going to leave that white for now. So light shadow here. And then there's, if you look carefully on the right side of the eye, there's almost a sort of boomerang, a wide boomerang shaped shadow here. So it's darkest in the corner, and there's a little bit of shading here, and then it wraps around. So it's going to be darker at the top because of the eyelashes and the eyelid, but it does curve around a little bit here. And you'll have a little bit of shadow right above the tear duct as well. So if you could go ahead and add in that shadow. Okay. Okay, so now let's move on to the iris, if that's okay. So you can go ahead and fill in the pupil, just avoid the areas that you've blocked off for the highlights, for the reflection. So shade in the pupil. And then, okay, and then I'm going to ask you to take a look at because we're going to take a look at these striations and the pattern on the iris and think about how can we capture this in drawing. So I do it by breaking it down into shapes and looking at it just a section at a time. So once you've drawn the colored in the pupil, which will be the darkest, let's look at this first layer coming out from the pupil to where there's this sort of zigzag white line on the iris. So you can draw a little very light line. Well, you can either draw a line with this sort of shape like this, or you could just go ahead and start filling it in using little, you know how some people draw, when they draw irises, they draw spokes. They use a sort of spoke method for indicating the pattern of striations in the iris. You can do this, but to use a sort of elliptical, let me show you. So it's sort of very lightly, I don't know if you can see that, draw an elliptical shape around, but also avoiding the highlights. So avoiding the highlights. And if you happen to have an eraser with a hard edge, then you can also use that to go back and pick out the zigzag line. So it's excellent if you have a hard eraser with a sharp edge to be able to pick out the white accents in the iris. So Isabella, I don't know where you are, but we were just we're starting to fill in the iris. So drawing the highlights, shape of the highlights here, the reflections, and then filling in the pupil. And then we're starting to break down the striations in the iris into shapes. So after you draw the first set of striations here, which have a sort of zigzag white line around it, then we can really go to the outside of the iris, and we can start from going from the outside in. So it's darker here, and you can see that there's sort of a pattern, and it doesn't have to be exact, right? You can draw this pattern, look at this shape from the outside, and draw that. It's quite irregular. And then start shading in from the outside, from the outer edge of the iris going in. And that will still leave this part in the middle that we haven't worked on yet. everyone. I tried to pack this workshop so full that we only have 10 minutes left. Can anyone stay over time a little bit? Okay, good, Sophie. Anyone else? Does anyone have to leave in 10 minutes? Okay, well then I'll just keep on moving along. All right. So then for the middle part of the iris, you can also think about this in terms of a long elliptical shape. And to just go around, repeat the pattern. And if you have one of those erasers with a hard edge, particularly a small eraser, you can pick out some of these lines. And so that's going to leave you with you've already shaded in the white of the eye. You've done the pupil and the iris. And I'll point out here that often when we're drawing eyes, there are interesting reflections in the eyes. So the highlights, the reflections are not just reflections. So for example, in this reflection, you can see part of a window on the left side. So there's an extra line that you may choose to include or not. And you can also see the reflection of the eyelashes. And so that also will really add to the realism of your drawing. So you can go ahead and add in the eyelashes, some of which are overlapping into your highlights, your reflections. How is everybody doing? What stage are you at? Rose, are you drawing with us? How about you, Sophie?
I'm still doing like the lines inside of the eye.
Okay. Okay, I think that I'm not sure if everybody can stay I'm going to go ahead and just give the instructions for the rest. And you can just, give me a message in chat if you'd like the reference fit, and I'll email it to you to finish working on this. So next, after you've worked on the iris, I would suggest looking at this upper fold in the eye. So there is a highlight here, and you can always, if you shade over that, you can always pick it out with your eraser. And this fold, as we said before, it casts a little shadow. So you can think about doing a little bit of the gentle shading going from dark to lighter on this part of the eye. And part of that will be covered up when you draw the eyelashes. And then there's a real dimension to this fold of skin coming out. And we know that the light is, well, it's hitting the brow, I guess the brow bone here. So you'll use the same technique here. It's rounded. So you'll start working on the shading and gradually get lighter and lighter and lighter up this way. And this is continuing the shadow from the right side of the eye, sort of going towards the temple a little bit. And I'll just lead you through the different steps, and then you can choose to work on whatever you want. And so then once you put in the eyelashes are, you don't necessarily want to draw them one by one. Some of them grow on top of each other. They often come out in clumps and they overlap a bit. But one thing you do want to remember is to start the eyelashes from the outer corner of the lid because of the thickness here. So the outer corner, these are the lower ones are overlapping. The upper eyelashes, you can see them a little bit here. So they're coming out of the upper part of the lid and then swooping down and up. So you can draw them this way, swooping down and up, all the way to the edge here. And then remember that we talked about the glabella and the side of the nose creating a cast shadow. There's also this cast shadow here under the brow bone. So when I do eye drawings like this, you can choose whether or not you want to put in the eyebrow. But if you put in the eyebrow, you might choose to use less dark strokes or to maybe even smudge it a little bit. With a photograph, it's a little bit blurry on the upper left side here. But you also want the viewer's attention to be on the eye itself. And so for the eyebrow to not distract from that part of the drawing. If anybody has questions and needs to leave, you can go ahead and ask them. Still have a few more slides I'd like to share. So while we have I pointed out the shadows around the fold of the skin above the eye, on the edge of the nose and the glabella, we also have to remember that there's going to be a shadow under the eye. So you might also want to put in a light shadow here. And you can also add in a couple of light, if you want, a couple of light lines indicating the crease of the skin. And then I think the only part I haven't talked about is the, excuse me, the area around the tear duct here, where we see two highlights. The nose is coming down. There's a little bit of shading. So you'll want to put a little shading around the edge of the tear duct. You can add a little shading here. And if you want, you can also add in a little shading underneath. So this is all going to add to the dimension of the eye. I should also let you know, for those of you who are leaving, that I'm planning to start some new 8-week courses this coming week on the 11th. I've cleared space in my schedule to teach on Fridays and Saturdays. So I'll be starting some new youth classes for different ages, depending on demand, and also adult classes. So all will be beginner drawing, and they run for 8 weeks. Until now, I've been mostly teaching over Zoom, but I can also offer some in-person outdoors classes. That's something that I did last summer. Isabel, that's fantastic. Great job. You're muted. Are you saying something, Isabel? No, you're muted, I think, Isabel. I'm not sure. I don't think I can unmute you. Okay, so I don't know if anybody can stay for longer. So I'm just going to briefly share a couple of slides of works that my other students have done. And then we can go back to this, or you can pop, direct message me, and I can send you the reference photo. So these are some drawings by my 10-year-old students. And you can see that they've learned how to use color. They note the shadows. So there's a shadow cast by the stem, shadow on the side of the apple, the highlights. And this, my student on the right, she also used what's called cross contour lines. So I often encourage this when you want to capture the shape of an object, like the roundness of an object. You might use lines that follow the contours. So here's some drawings by some of my adult students. And these were students who, this was their first drawing course as adults. They had retired and they were able to do this within the first 8 weeks. So they did a really great job. So for this rabbit drawing class and the horse drawing class, I teach about proportions. We go over the outline. We make sure that everything's accurate, and then they choose the colors that they want to work with. And I also teach them some methods for recreating fur, for drawing manes, etc. And so this is just, if you're interested in any courses over the summer, I have this tiny URL.com/drawing courses that you can fill out, or just contact me at Mei-Ling.Ellerman, so that no hyphen. Sometimes certain things allow hyphens, certain things don't. So Mei-Ling.Ellerman@gmail.com. There's my Instagram address and also my website. And if anybody has questions, go ahead and ask. I'd love to hear from you. Yes.
I have a question. If we want feedback, can we still take a picture and email it to you for this
Absolutely.
last exercise? Okay,
Sure.
thank you. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. And if you do want me to send you the reference photo, you can just direct message me in the chat, and I'll copy your email and send it to you. Okay. Okay. Okay, got a couple of requests. All right, so I think I'm going to stop this screen share and see if I can change to a gallery view. If everyone wants to just hold up your work, if you'd like to, come on and hold up your work, I'd love to see it. Oh, that's great, Sophie. Wonderful, Stephanie. Isabel, I love how you captured all the contours. Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending today. And you have my email if you want to send me your drawing for feedback, or if you have any questions. Thank you, Sophie, for the applause. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a great weekend.